9 Stoic truths that break the cycle of self-sabotage. The invisible cycle that silently drains you. You wake up, maybe feeling heavy, maybe hopeful, but deep down, carrying a quiet, timid promise. Today will be different. Yet, as the day unfolds, it becomes the same as always. You catch yourself repeating the same patterns, the same detours, the same delays, and by nightfall, that bitter feeling returns. That yet another day has passed and you didn't move. But it's not laziness, and it's not a lack of willpower either. It's something more subtle, deeper, a silent cycle that erodes you from within. Self-sabotage doesn't scream, it whispers. It disguises itself as tiredness, as justification, as distraction. And by the time you notice, you're already deep in it, repeating actions that lead nowhere, feeding thoughts that shrink you, believing in versions of yourself that no longer serve you. This cycle isn't broken with brute force, because strength without clarity is just another form of control. And what this cycle wants most is for you to exhaust yourself trying to beat it with noise. True rupture begins with vision, with awareness, with the courage to see, without judgment, where you're still trapped. Because what truly imprisons is what remains unseen. Stoicism doesn't come to push you, it comes to awaken you, to remind you there's a difference between moving and being moved. That there's a gap between what you want and what you repeat. And that this gap can only be filled with one kind of presence, the one that chooses, even when tired, that sees, even when it hurts, that keeps going, even without certainty. You're not broken, you're distracted, hypnotized by an inner narrative that repeats, "It doesn't matter," but it does. It always has. You just haven't stayed long enough to see, to feel, to harvest. And maybe this video won't change everything, but maybe it will be the pause, the cut, the crack, the first fracture in that invisible cycle that's been draining you, and now begins to be seen. And anything that is seen can be transformed with clarity, with presence, with silence, with strength. Yours, that even dimmed, has never stopped burning. The mind that doubts protects itself by giving up. Self-sabotage doesn't come from weakness. It comes from protection, from an internal mechanism trying to spare you from pain. Because deep down, there's a subtle, almost imperceptible belief that it's better not to try than to fail, that it's safer to quit before the fall than to fall for real. And so, without realizing, you begin to protect yourself from yourself. This protection doesn't look like fear, it looks like logic, like prudence, like that calm voice that says, "You're not ready. Today isn't a good day. It'll be worse if it goes wrong." And behind these lines is a pain that was never welcomed, the pain of past disappointment, of an old mistake, of the quiet shame you carried and swore you'd never feel again. But what you haven't yet seen is that the fear of disappointment paralyzes more than failure ever could. Because failure at least teaches, it reveals paths, it offers truth. But the fear of disappointment keeps you still, and it's in stillness that the soul becomes ill. Because it came into this world to grow, not to hide. Stoicism invites you to a deeper gaze. It says, observe your reactions. Observe where you quit before you begin, where you sabotage before you try, where you create perfect strategies that exist only to justify inaction. Because real failure isn't about getting it wrong. It's remaining whole in a place where there's no growth. It's staying in the same spot out of fear of the next one. You don't need to face everything at once, but you do need to see. You need to notice where your mind, in an effort to protect you, is keeping you imprisoned. And the key isn't in conquering fear, it's in walking with it, gently, presently, calmly. Think of a child who falls. She gets hurt. She cries, and then she tries again, not because she forgot, but because she knows instinctively that falling is part of it. That movement matters more than safety, and that wisdom is still in you. You just need to remember. Because the mind that gives up to protect can also keep going for freedom. And that choice is in your hands now. You repeat what doesn't heal out of fear of the void. Why we hold on to painful patterns just because they feel familiar. There are patterns that hurt, Yet you cling to them, not because you enjoy the pain, but because it's already familiar. It has shape. It has a script. And what's familiar, even when it wounds, feels safer than what hasn't yet been named. You keep repeating what doesn't heal you because, in some way, that old pain became a shelter. An uncomfortable shelter, yes, but familiar. Human beings would rather endure a pain they understand than face a silence they don't know how to inhabit. That's why we stay where it hurts. In the same relationships, the same excuses, the same habits that promise comfort but deliver imprisonment. And freedom, that word so longed for, starts to feel distant or even dangerous. Epictetus once said, "It's not events that disturb us, but our interpretation of them." And reacting has become automatic. You no longer choose, you just repeat. You repeat the hurry, the disinterest, the self-abandonment disguised as reality. But living is not repeating. Living is presence, and presence demands courage. The courage to stop filling the void with the same old noise. Self-sabotage doesn't want you to see this, because once you see it, everything changes. That's why it keeps you busy, addicted to stimulation, always chasing some distraction. But eventually, the body gets tired, the soul screams, and the cracks in the cycle start to show. Stoicism invites you not to run from the void, but to sit with it, to face what surfaces when you stop avoiding, because sometimes it's in that uncomfortable silence that truth appears. The truth that you can choose differently. The truth that healing doesn't begin with grand decisions. It begins with small interruptions in the repetition. Think of an old radio playing the same sound for years. One day you turn it off, and in the silence, something new emerges. A space, a crack, a possibility. You don't have to fill everything right now. You just need to stop numbing yourself with what's already made you sick and allow the void to be soil, not threat, because it's there. That true change germinates, even in silence, even without applause, even with fear. Every excuse is an escape disguised as protection. You've heard this voice. It comes gently with understanding. It says, "Just today, you need to rest. Later will be better." And suddenly, what was a break becomes a routine. What was an exception becomes a habit. What seemed like self-care turns into stagnation. These phrases aren't blatant lies. They're half-truths. Arguments that make sense, but deep down, they hide fear. Fear of starting, fear of continuing, fear of being seen, fear of failing, so you hide in commitments to others, in urgent tasks, in thoughts that justify why now is not the right time. But Stoicism doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It acts on real ground because it knows the ideal will never come. There will always be tiredness, always distraction, always a legitimate reason to postpone. And that's exactly why action has value, because it's done in spite of everything. Every time you give in to an excuse, you reinforce the idea that you need perfect conditions to move. But the Stoic moves with what they have, with the pain, with the doubt, with the tired body, because they don't rely on impulse. They rely on decision. The problem isn't rest. The problem is resting to avoid facing yourself, to avoid commitment, to avoid change. Escape, even when disguised as care, is still escape. And when it repeats, it becomes identity. An identity that paralyzes, numbs, and keeps you exactly where you are. Think of a wild animal that learned to live in captivity. It no longer tries to leave because the habit of protection turned into prison, and the door is open, but it forgot what it's like to walk beyond it. You don't have to fight your excuses. You just need to stop feeding them with blind presence. You need to see them, name them, interrupt them, even if just for a minute. Because awareness is already a beginning of freedom, and with it the excuse loses its power. Because now you see, and everything that is seen begins to dissolve. What holds you back isn't the effort, it's the doubt about your purpose. Why you're not tired of trying. You're tired of not knowing why. You're not tired because you try too much. You're tired because you no longer know why you're trying. The weight doesn't come from the effort, It comes from the lack of meaning, because when the purpose is clear, the body gets tired, but the soul stands firm. When there's direction, even difficulty becomes fuel. But when there isn't, everything feels heavy. You say you're lazy, but what you feel is disorientation. You say you lack focus, but what's missing is connection to something greater. And then, even the habits that could strengthen you start to feel like punishment. Discipline turns into obligation, movement turns into pressure, and the desire to stop begins to feel like freedom. Stoicism doesn't separate effort from meaning. For the Stoic, action is only virtuous when aligned with logos, with inner reason, with the soul's center. That's why, before disciplining the body, you must ask the soul, why does this matter to me? Without that answer, every habit becomes a burden, every routine a prison. You've already tried to do everything right, but maybe you forgot to feel, forgot to ask if what you're chasing still makes sense, if the path still reflects who you are, or if you're just repeating an old goal, afraid to look inconsistent. It's not effort that holds you back. It's the doubt about why to keep going, and that doubt is valid. It deserves to be heard, because sometimes what you need isn't to change the plan. It's to remember why you started, or, with courage, allow yourself to change course. Changing isn't failure. Persisting without purpose is. Think of a runner who keeps going without knowing where they're headed. Every step hurts more, because there's no destination, no map, no purpose. But when the goal becomes clear, even the fatigue gains rhythm, because the body tires, but clarity drives. You don't need more strength, you need more meaning. And that meaning doesn't need to be grand, it only needs to be true. When it appears, what once felt like effort becomes path. And then, yes, you move again, not out of obligation, but out of direction. The comfort zone is the altar of self-sabotage. You call it comfort, but deep down, you know it's stagnation. You know it's the repetition of the same. A space where there's no sharp pain, but also no growth. Where there's no risk, but no truth either. The comfort zone feels like protection, but it's a prison dressed in routine, and every day you stay there is a day you don't expand. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes strong by resisting its weaknesses." And that's exactly what the comfort zone prevents. It doesn't challenge you. It doesn't demand from you. It doesn't reflect you. And that's why it weakens you, slowly, subtly, until you no longer know what it's like to live fully, only to survive in the familiar. Self-sabotage loves this space, because in it you don't feel bad enough to change, nor good enough to flourish. You stay there, in limbo, in maintenance mode, a way of living that seems stable, but steals pieces of your potential every day. And the soul, which came into this world to grow, starts to wither. The Stoic knows that comfort is not a goal, it's a consequence. Real comfort comes from internal coherence, from living aligned with one's own reason, and that requires discomfort. It requires friction. It requires the courage to go beyond the known, because often, what you call peace is just well-organized escape. You can see this in the way you avoid the new, how you postpone that difficult conversation, how you rationalize your inertia with talk of being realistic, but the body feels it. The soul knows it, and silence starts to weigh. Think of a plant placed in a pot that's too small. It stops growing, not because it lacks strength, but because the space no longer allows it. The pot must be broken, and yes, that makes noise. That causes pain, but only then can the roots find space to go on. You don't need to run from your comfort zone, but you must stop treating it as your permanent shelter, because anything that stays too still begins to rot, and you were made to move, to break through, to live with the wholeness of someone who knows. The soul grows in the discomfort that frees, and it is in that discomfort that you'll find yourself again. You weaken yourself every time you negotiate with yourself. Why broken promises to yourself are more damaging than failure. Every time you say, "just not today," something in you breaks. It's not the habit that's lost. It's the internal trust. It's not the plan that fails. It's the image you have of yourself that starts to crumble. Because with every small promise you break to yourself, you silently teach your mind that you are not reliable. And that corrodes more than any external criticism ever could. Self-sabotage feeds on that space. The space between what you said you would do and what you actually do. And what weakens you most isn't failure. It's getting used to not following through. It's treating your own word as disposable, as something that doesn't need to be honored, as something always up for renegotiation. Stoicism teaches that consistency is the foundation of virtue, and consistency isn't perfection. It's not rigidity. It's quiet commitment. It's getting up and doing it even when you don't feel like it. It's repeating even when no one is watching. It's upholding a choice, because it reflects who you want to become, not what you happen to feel in the moment. You don't need to get everything right, but you do need to start listening to yourself, to start taking yourself seriously, to realize that self-respect begins right there, in the gap between what you say and what you do, because that's where your identity is built. That's where your soul begins to trust you again. Think of a foundation. It's built slowly, layer by layer, but a recurring crack can compromise the entire structure. That's what your integrity is like. It's made of small promises kept, of small decisions upheld, of small silent victories that no one sees, but that hold everything together. Want to regain your strength? Start by not negotiating with yourself anymore. Not because of tiredness, not because of fear, not because of momentary pleasure. Tell yourself, I said I would do it, so I will. Wait. And in that gesture, something in you begins to change, begins to heal, begins to remember that consistency is one of the names of freedom and of healing. Sustained action teaches your mind that you are trustworthy. It's not the size of the gesture, it's the repetition of it. It's the silent loyalty to a choice you made and now uphold, even when no one applauds, even when no one sees, because your mind is always watching. It learns from what you do, and every time you stay the course, even small, even tired, it records, I can trust myself. Self-confidence doesn't come from words. It comes from patterns, from repeated actions that carve a new path, that slowly break the cycle of self-sabotage. Because the mind that sabotages is the same mind that was once betrayed by you. It's the same mind that heard promises unfulfilled, that saw goals abandoned, that felt hope wither after yet another restart that didn't last. But it can relearn, it can be retrained, and the training is simple, but demands consistency. You show your mind that you are trustworthy by continuing, even without immediate results, even without clarity, even without certainty. Discipline in this space is not a burden. It's an act of love, a quiet reminder, I'm still here. Stoicism understands this kind of persistence. It doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for presence. It teaches that virtue lives in the repetition of what is good, not in the grandeur of a single act. That's why what you do today, even if small, carries weight. It matters. It has impact. Think of a candle lit in darkness. It doesn't light up the whole room, but it proves that light is possible, and in time, if more candles are lit around it, the darkness recedes. That's how your mind responds to sustained action. It lights up, it aligns, it begins to trust again. You don't need to win every day. You just need to show up. You need to keep walking, even slowly, because every repeated step says something powerful to your soul. I haven't given up on myself. And that phrase is worth more than any fleeting motivation, because it builds, in the silence of repetition, the foundation of your new self, a self that is worthy of trust, because it no longer promises, it simply does, and does again, until becoming no longer takes effort, only presence. Progress doesn't require speed, it requires the courage to stay. Why slow, steady presence breaks the cycle more than intensity ever could. You want to break the cycle. You want to see change. You want to feel progress. And because of that, you rush. You believe you need to arrive quickly, transform everything, fix your life in a matter of days. But that urgency is just another disguise of self-sabotage. because what it truly fears is staying. The soul doesn't mature at the pace of the mind. The body doesn't transform at the speed of anxiety. What truly heals happens slowly, in silence, through repetition. And that's why true progress doesn't reveal itself in grand gestures. It shows up when you continue, even without emotion, even without motivation, even without signs of victory nearby. Self-sabotage feeds on urgency because it knows that the more rushed you are, the more impatient you'll become with life's natural processes. And in impatience, you quit. You abandon, you convince yourself it's not for you, but it was. It always was. You just didn't stay long enough to see the fruit. Marcus Aurelius taught that the soul is strengthened not by results, but by the constant decision not to deviate. And not deviating means resisting the temptation to stop just because it's taking too long. It's holding to the practice, even when it seems to be leading nowhere. It's walking with the awareness that deep transformation has no shortcuts. Think of a sculptor working with hard stone. Each strike seems too small. Each day feels like the last, but he knows what he's doing. He doesn't measure progress in inches. He measures it by his loyalty to the shape he envisions, even when no one else can see it. You don't need to rush. You need to remain. You need to keep showing up for yourself, even when the world doesn't notice. Because the world always comes after. It always recognizes after. It always understands after. But you can decide now. Decide that you will continue, that you will stay, that you will stand, even when everything around you screams, give up. Progress is not speed, it's perseverance, and perseverance requires courage. The courage to be repetition, the courage to be silence, the courage to be consistency in a world that only values instant results. That kind of courage is what breaks the cycle, and in the ruins of that broken cycle, a new path emerges. Yours, steady, quiet, real. You already have what you need. Choice. Why you are not lacking. You are remembering. There's nothing missing in you. Not strength, not intelligence, not capacity. What's missing is remembering. Remembering that you already have what matters most, that you carry within you everything needed to break the cycle. And that word isn't miracle, nor motivation. It's choice. Self-sabotage isn't a flaw, it's a habit. An old pattern that repeats because for a long time it was the only way you knew how to handle pain. But now you see, now you understand, and anything seen clearly is already beginning to change. Stoicism never promised a life without mistakes, but it offers something deeper, a life where each mistake becomes a step, where every stumble becomes a reminder, where every new beginning, no matter how small, is already a seed of integrity. You don't need to wait one more day, or for one more certainty, or for sudden motivation. What you need is already here, in this moment, in this body, in this awareness. It's the silent decision to continue, even with fear, even while tired, even if you're beginning for the 100th time. Think of a field. It already has the soil, the light, the air. All that's missing is the planting, and planting doesn't require euphoria. It requires presence, intention, consistency. So now return to yourself, breathe, notice what's still alive inside, and choose. Choose with the calm firmness of someone who has understood they no longer need to fight themselves. They just need to walk with more gentleness, with more truth, with the serene courage of someone who has finally decided not to abandon themselves again, because that's how the cycle is broken, from within, not in haste, but in decision. And you've already decided, because you're here, still here. And that is the beginning of everything.